Hello, my name is Edward Sonino, and I'd like to read you an article that I wrote on January 6th of this year, 2025, with the title 19 Gross Failures of the Harris Campaign Led to Defeat. The subtitle is Will Biden Defend Our Constitution? Enforcing the 14th Amendment's Section 3. So, the Harris-Walz campaign could have quickly eliminated Trump's favorite open borders issue, thereby taking all the wind out of his sails. How? By simply calling for a very effective yet humanitarian administrative reform through an executive order by Biden before the election. That executive order would require all asylum seekers to make their asylum applications at the U.S. consulate in their country of residence, never at our border. Just like tourist and work visa applications are made in U.S. consulates in the country of residence, never at our borders. Illegals currently in the United States would be required to register online or at a post office with a new illegal immigration website and return to their country of origin within 2 months of the executive order without prejudice. They would then be able to apply for expedited asylum papers or work visas at U.S. consulates in their own country. Illegals who are found not complying with the 2-month deadline would be prevented from ever applying for work visas or asylum papers and would be deported. Harris should have followed up by committing to finish the wall, adding that Trump's failure to complete it in his 4 years as president and to have Mexico pay for it as he promised demonstrated his incompetence as well as his being a con man, fooling naive American voters. Inexplicably, Harris did not repeatedly demand that Trump explain why he didn't finish the wall, to put him on the spot. Harris should have also explained the importance of instituting a major Peace Corps program for helping poor Latin American nations develop socially and economically. The program would focus on investments in schools with an enlightened curriculum and in essential infrastructure, providing many attractive jobs for Americans. Not asking Biden to immediately reform asylum applications through an executive order was a gross failure of the Harris campaign. Such reform would likely have been an election clincher. Kamala should have publicly admitted that the Biden administration failed miserably to solve the border crisis, while underlining that Biden, not she, was in charge. Harris should have also explained to everyone, Americans and migrants, that asylum applies only to persons persecuted by their own government, not to persons fleeing poverty and crime. That was a truly egregious omission, since there is a general misunderstanding of asylum requirements, not just among migrants and our citizens, but even among our own politicians. She missed the chance to show that she was much better informed on asylum law than any other politician, and that she could come up with a simple, effective, rapid solution, along with sustainable long-term solution. A second gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not explaining what tariffs are and how they work, persuasively rebutting Trump's false claims that foreign nations would pay the tariffs when it's American importers who pay them, and then pass the cost on to consumers. Most Trump voters do not understand that his tariffs plan is actually bad for consumers, being inflationary. Of crucial importance, Harris should have also pointed out the gross fallacy of Trump's tariff plan, explaining that high tariffs significantly reduce imports and consequently reduce tariff revenues. There would never have been any tariff revenue gusher, contrary to Trump's assertion. That revelation would have severely damaged Trump's campaign, demonstrating beyond a doubt that his plan is a pipe dream or intentional campaign fraud. Harris should have challenged Trump to prove his claim that very high tariffs would lead to huge tariff revenues by giving practical examples. She should have stated that Trump jumps to false conclusions that go counter to common sense and are based on a superficial understanding of reality, when he is not simply lying to naive and undereducated citizens to get their votes. Harris should have explained why higher tariffs would lead to higher inflation and higher interest rates, and even to an economic slowdown and rising unemployment. Inexplicably, she did not, either due to not having a firm grasp of economics or to not being politically competent. What about her campaign advisors and Democratic Party leaders? It seems they too were incompetent. As for Trump's pushing for the US government to invest in an enormous Bitcoin reserve to complement its gold reserves, it makes absolutely no sense, other than to bail out crypto speculators wishing to sell their enormous Bitcoin holdings at a high price. It would cost a veritable fortune to buy large amounts of Bitcoins, meaning an enormous increase in our federal debt and budget deficits. It would result in higher interest rates, as the Treasury would have to issue large amounts of new Treasury bonds to buy those Bitcoins. That in turn would initially lead to a slowing economy and higher unemployment. It then would remain to be seen how the Bitcoin sellers would deploy their newly obtained dollars. All those negatives, without considering that cryptos are nothing more than algorithms with no intrinsic value, operating on the greater fool or musical chairs theory. Bitcoin has gone up enormously in price since its inception about 20 years ago, but one day it can come crashing down due to either a massive hacking, which destroys or steals large amounts of Bitcoins, or to a sudden general realization that it is nothing but empty hype, ultimately nothing but fool's gold, apart from being the best tool for money laundering and tax evasion by criminals. Biden and Harris should make the point that Trump made large investments in Bitcoin himself this past summer. Therefore, his push for Treasury reserves of Bitcoin is clearly tainted by self-interest, another instance of Trump putting himself above his country. A third gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not proposing an original but highly effective sustainable solution to our addiction crisis, given that the war on drugs has been a colossal failure. Harris should have pointed out that our drug crisis is mistakenly and demagogically blamed on the Chinese and the Mexicans, as though they were force-feeding Americans with fentanyl and other illegal addictive drugs. The truth is that we have large numbers of mentally disturbed American addicts who are looking to buy fentanyl and other drugs and voluntarily taking them. Harris should have insisted that there is no quick remedy, that the only effective solution is a sustainable one, that is, prevention, requiring all our public high schools to have 4-year courses on psychology, accompanied by group therapy and good parenting workshops, along with individual assistance for students having academic or psychological difficulties. Harris should have explained why the solution for the addiction crisis also applies to our gun and violence crises, since they are also due to mentally disturbed individuals. A fourth gross failure by the Harris-Walz campaign was not clearly explaining the causes of the 2022-2023 inflation, showing that it was not caused by the Biden administration's policies. There was no instant solution, since the problem was caused not by Biden's economic policy, but by COVID supply chain disruptions, and then by Russia invading Ukraine, causing fuel and food prices to soar. Harris and Walz blundered by not persuasively explaining that to the voters, and by contributing to voter wrath by disingenuously accusing companies of price gouging, when that is impossible in a competitive free market. They should have made clear that price controls were not the solution, being counterproductive, causing shortages. The only avenue was to be patient and trust the competitive free market economy to gradually lower prices through adjusting to COVID disruptions and to the negative effects of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Inflation has in fact trended much lower over the past year, but that does not mean that all prices will actually decline. Harris should have also made clear that it is normal, not abusive, for businesses to pass on their increased costs to consumers, including minimum wage increases. It was also incompetent of Harris to not clearly explain the difference between inflation and price levels, which few voters know or fully understand. That distinction is crucial for understanding that since the Biden administration was not responsible for the inflation spike of 2021-2022, it was also not responsible for the rise in the price level and its subsequent failure to decline along with the inflation rate. It was also incompetent of Harris not to repeatedly explain how Biden's enormous COVID stimulus was just what the economy needed to quickly recover from the deep COVID recession, and that Biden should be applauded for that, not criticized, even if it led to temporarily high inflation by maintaining consumer demand even while supply was constrained by COVID supply chain disruptions. The alternative was no big stimulus, sky-high unemployment, and a long, deep recession, if not a veritable depression. Harris should have repeatedly challenged Trump to explain what he would have done given his incessant criticisms. She should have put him on the spot and demonstrated to the voters that his criticisms were totally invalid. A fifth gross failure by the Harris-Walz campaign was not having recognized a simple housing affordability solution, which would have been another election clincher. The housing affordability crisis is due to a significant degree to a big shortage of existing homes for sale. A very popular and effective solution would be the elimination of the capital gains tax on primary homes owned and occupied for over 3 years. That would instantly lead to unblocking many home sales, which are constrained by the current tax law, whereby up to 40% of the proceeds of selling primary homes are lost to federal, state, and local taxes whenever there are very large capital gains, a common occurrence when homes were bought many years prior to sale. In fact, many homeowners wishing to move or downsize refuse to sell their primary home precisely because they would end up losing a large chunk of their home equity due to capital gains taxes. The Harris-Walz plan to build 3 million homes was not persuasive, since it would take many years to complete, thereby providing no immediate relief. An even better solution would be replacing the capital gains tax on all home sales, not just primary homes, with a flat federal 10% transfer tax, payable by the buyer, just like retail sales taxes, which are paid by buyers, not sellers. A flat 10% transfer tax on real estate sales would actually generate much more tax revenue than the current capital gains tax by multiplying the number of real estate sales each year, as well as by eliminating the use of tax shelters and the current $500,000 capital gains exemption. The same goes for stock market sales, since enormous amounts of capital are frozen in stock positions with large capital gains. Replacing the capital gains tax with a maximum 10% federal transfer tax on stock sales, payable by the buyers, not the sellers, just like retail sales taxes, that would result in much higher tax revenues, as stock turnover would greatly increase, usage of tax shelters would plunge, and capital loss deductions would disappear. Had Harris proposed a maximum 10% federal transfer tax, the federal estate and federal gift transfer tax is a precedent. So, Harris proposed a maximum 10% federal transfer tax for all real estate and stock sales in lieu of capital gains taxes, she would have won over a very large number of Republican voters and swept to victory by a wide margin. She would have taught the Democratic Party that being pro-investment is an election winner. Tax revenues are actually increased. Consequently, social expenditures can also be increased, even while benefiting wealthier citizens. That's a triple win. A win-win-win. She would have taught the Democratic Party that the politics of envy and class warfare is an election loser, apart from being a drag on the economy, hurting all citizens, rich and poor. By eliminating capital gains taxes through a maximum 10% federal transfer tax payable by the buyers, Harris would have silenced repeated, absurd, dishonest Republican accusations, even by Trump himself, that she and the Democratic Party are communists, which cost her and the Democrats many votes and probably the election. Unfortunately, the Democrats don't understand economics and can't properly defend themselves against false accusations of being communists. Probably many of those accusing Harris and the Democrats of being communists can't properly define and explain what communism is. As far as the accusers who can properly define and explain communism, they are dishonest, relying on the ignorance of many citizens who will blindly believe in their lies. Kamala should have clearly explained why accusations she was a communist were clearly false due to dishonesty or to ignorance. She had to persuasively discredit them, but did not. Why? Had Kamala added a legal justification for replacing capital gains taxes with a flat 10% federal transfer tax, she would have been very impressive and gained widespread admiration among Republicans. The legal justification would have consisted of pointing out that capital gains are mischaracterized as income. In fact, they are not income, such as salaries, dividends, interest, and royalties, which are streams of received money occurring without any sales. Capital gains, instead, consist of money received from the sale of appreciated private property. That is not income. Importantly, it must be understood that the proceeds of a sale of private property are constitutionally not subject to income taxes, only to sales and transfer taxes. Why? Because personal property cannot be taxed. Only the transfer of private property can be taxed. That explains why the estate tax is not a tax on property, as the estate tax law explicitly states, but rather a tax on the transfer of estate assets. In fact, the estate tax is a congressional fraud on American citizens, since it is clearly an unconstitutional tax on property masqueraded as a transfer tax. The estate tax law is sloppy, full of fatal contradictions, demonstrating bad faith, as all the reference points are the date of death, not the date or dates of asset transfers. How can it be a transfer tax when it is due within 9 months of death, even before any transfers take place? Many estate asset transfers occur more than 9 months after death, after all. And how can it be a transfer tax when asset valuations are as of the date of death, not as of the date of transfers? Furthermore, it should be noted that since estate asset transfers are free, not commercial, they should not be subject to any sales or transfer tax. The same goes for gifts. How can gifts be taxed like income or sales when they consist of free, non-commercial transfers? The Constitution only provides for transfer taxes, such as sales taxes, on commercial transactions. Therefore, both the estate and gift transfer taxes are unconstitutional. Furthermore, since the maximum sales tax on commercial transfers in all states is always under 10%, taxing non-commercial transfers makes no sense at rates up to 4 times the sales tax rates, similar to top income tax rates, revealing that the legislators treated estate and gift transfers as income. The taxation of non-commercial free transfers of private property, such as estate and gift transfers, is clearly unconstitutional, going against the basic principle of non-taxation of private property that comes from the Fifth Amendment, where there's no taxation of private property is allowed. Only the sale of private property can be taxed, either at the going sales tax rate of the state where the sale takes place, or at the 10% federal transfer tax whenever it preempts state sales taxes. A sixth growth failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was Harris not having challenged Trump to release his college transcripts and not having asked him why he has hidden them from the American public all these years, adding that she believes it's because his grades were terrible, and that Trump, being so embarrassed to reveal his transcripts, shows that he has a severe inferiority complex, which is a dangerous trait for any president who may well try to compensate for it in very inappropriate ways against the interests of the nation. Highlighting Trump's refusal to release his college transcripts would have undoubtedly undermined his image and campaign. A seventh gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign would turn out to be the failure to demand that the Butler, Pennsylvania hospital and doctors release Trump's injured ear records and photos. In fact, it was highly suspicious of Trump to prohibit the hospital and its doctors from releasing the records. The issue was national security and terrorism, not medical privacy. The question which must be answered is, why did Trump not want the records, including photos of his injured ear, supposedly grazed by a bullet during the Butler, Pennsylvania rally, made public? One possible logical answer is that his ear was not grazed, which Trump wanted to hide. Very possibly it was bloodied not by a bullet, but by a pouch of blood taped behind his ear, which burst when Trump slapped his ear after hearing a rifle shot. By the way, who thinks Trump is honest and not a professional rigger? That scenario is supported by the very suspicious circumstance that the Secret Service and the local and state police did not secure access to the roof from which Thomas Matthew Crooks shot and killed Cory Comparatore, who was seated in the lower stands behind Trump's platform to Trump's lower right. One could speculate that the apparent assassination attempt was a setup organized to raise sympathy for Trump, whose polls were falling. In such case, the plot would have consisted of finding a naive sharpshooter and convincing him that Trump was going to be shot by Comparatore, and to be a hero by shooting Comparatore before he could shoot Trump during the rally speech. The Secret Service sharpshooters would have had Crooks targeted and shot him immediately after he shot Comparatore to eliminate him as a witness to the plot. As for the blood on Trump's ear, according to this scenario, it would have come from a small pouch of blood taped behind Trump's ear, which burst when Trump slapped his ear immediately upon hearing Crooks' first shot. A very significant detail is that from Crooks' line of sight towards Trump, it was very unlikely he could have grazed Trump's right ear. He could have only shot him directly at his right temple, if Trump's head was the target, when Trump was talking to the crowd below his platform, or directly at his forehead when Trump turned to his right to look at a poster with graphics. The chances of grazing Trump's right ear were very slim. So, if Trump is looking forward to the crowd below, and Crooks is about 100 yards to Trump's right, the line of sight is directly towards Trump, and if Trump is looking at the crowd, the shot would hit him Trump in the temple. If the shot occurred while Trump had turned his head to look at the poster with the graphics, then the shot would have hit Trump in the forehead, right square in the middle of the forehead. Almost impossible to graze the ear you can't graze the ear when Trump is looking this way. You hit it directly. It's not grazed. And if Trump is turned to the right, well, he'd be hitting him in the forehead. He wouldn't be grazing the ear. So, due to such logical suspicions of foul play, heightened by Trump's recent admission that maybe his ear was grazed by shrapnel, not by a bullet, and that nobody else in his immediate vicinity was hit, Harris should have publicly insisted that President Biden immediately require the release of the hospital records, including photos of Trump's injured right ear, to confirm that Trump's ear was indeed grazed. She should have publicly insisted that Biden demand Trump allow the FBI, the White House physician, himself and herself, to check Trump's ear for any sign of a bullet grazing. She should have also demanded that Trump explain why he prohibited the Butler, PA hospital from releasing the records. If the totality of the evidence pointed to a Trump conspiracy, which included the purposeful killing of both Comparatore and Crooks, immediate indictments would have been required, along with an expedited trial concluding well before January 20th, 2025, if not even before Election Day. A finding of guilt regarding Butler, PA would nullify the November 5th election and make Harris the winner. An eighth gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not publicly insisting that Biden make clear that he will not tolerate any more instances of unjustified judicial delays, deeming them part of a conspiracy to help Trump. From the outset of her presidential campaign, Harris should have underlined the principle of justice delayed is justice denied, and that it should not be allowed to be openly violated. In the same vein, Harris should have publicly called for Biden to make sure that Jack Smith's January 6 criminal insurrection case be immediately expedited, noting the Supreme Court's transparently biased delay tactics, as well as the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case, which deserves to be investigated for outrageous judicial bias, conflict of interest requiring recusal, and malpractice due to repeated unjustified delays by Judge Eileen Cannon, a Trump appointee, as well as by the Supreme Court. Harris should have driven home the point that innocent defendants want their trial to proceed quickly, being confident of establishing their innocence and wanting to clear their name. Only guilty defendants do their best to delay their trials. No one disputes that. And what did Trump do with all his trials? He used delay tactics over and over again. That the courts, including the Supreme Court, allowed totally unjustified delays clearly to favor Trump, who never objected, indeed constantly asked for more delays, raises serious concerns of judicial bias and illegality. Harris should have publicly declared that such unjustified delays must be investigated. As for the classified documents Trump illegally brought to Mar-a-Lago and stored in view of everyone, including in a public bathroom, in willful disregard of national security, why did Harris not repeatedly make the point that Trump was either willfully exposing them to the public, even to spies, or totally disregarding the necessity of having them secured? Why did Harris not repeatedly emphasize the illegality of Trump's bringing the classified documents to Mar-a-Lago and the national security dangers incurred? Harris, along with Biden, should have asserted that they had taken note of the Supreme Court's recent decision to grant absolute immunity to all presidents, not just to Trump, for all official decisions made within the scope of governing and defending the Constitution, democracy, and the rule of law. Also, that both she and Biden are committed to combating, by all means necessary, every single instance of obstruction of justice, even by the judiciary, and every single conspiracy to undermine democracy and the rule of law. Harris should have stated that various Republican judges, including on the Supreme Court, have played bad faith hardball with the Biden administration, arguably having obstructed and subverted justice with outrageous bias in favor of Trump, unconscionable delay tactics, and refusal to properly recuse due to conflict of interest, bringing to mind the rise of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party. Biden, together with Harris, should have asserted that they will not go down in history as the president and vice president who failed to defend our Constitution and our democracy to their utmost ability against foreign and domestic threats, that they will avail themselves of absolute immunity if necessary, even down to the wire, that they refuse to be intimidated, and will ensure that the Supreme Court is not above the law, delegitimizing itself by abusive behavior and patently biased decisions, and even by refusing to adopt strict, enforceable ethics rules. Furthermore, Harris should have publicly admitted that Biden was gravely mistaken not to have insisted that Trump be immediately indicted for the January 6th seditious insurrection and conspiracy in early 2021, after having been sworn in as president. There was no need to wait for the congressional hearings to provide convincing evidence of the insurrection and Trump's participation in it. Conclusive, irrefutable evidence was broadcast live for everyone to see and preserved on videotape, including the danger Vice President Pence was subjected to. Remember the "Hang Mike Pence" cries by many rioters, "Hang Mike Pence," as well as many Democrat senators fearfully hiding behind closed doors from the violent insurrectionist mob. Again, she should have reminded everyone that being vice president, she was not in charge, Biden was. But her failure as a presidential candidate to implement an effective strategy based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to block Trump's candidacy is embarrassing, suggesting gross legal and political incompetence. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment bars any insurrectionist from running for high office, including the presidency, of course. Harris could have rallied all the major law schools to weigh in on the matter, to bolster attempts to block Trump's candidacy on the grounds of the 14th Amendment's Section 3. Why did she not? How many law school faculties would have argued against applying Section 3 to Trump's candidacy? That's highly unlikely. Why was she not able to rally the majority of the nation in defense of the Constitution, making the point that one function of the Constitution is to put solid guardrails against voter or legislator foolishness, such as voting for or defending an insurrectionist or violating the Constitution? Why did Harris not repeatedly point out the dishonesty of Trump's supporters, who call the extremely violent insurrectionists mere tourists, peaceful tourists? Why did she not point out Trump's dishonesty and hypocrisy, calling his insurrectionists patriots or hostages whenever they were found guilty and imprisoned? That was an outrageous insult to Americans' intelligence and to our democracy. Presidents or presidential candidates who don't vigorously defend the Constitution against insurrectionists and don't rebut all lies by insurrectionists and their supporters are weak and incompetent. How can we have ended up in such a predicament? By not having high qualification requirements for all political candidates. Just being a lawyer does not make one qualified to be in high office. We logically require doctors, lawyers, architects, and engineers to obtain a relevant advanced degree before practicing their profession. Why do we illogically not require all our political candidates to obtain an advanced degree in economic, social, and foreign policy, the matters which presidents have to lead on, before running for office? Why do we not expect our political candidates to have a verified high level of relevant knowledge and competence? Why do we not demand that they demonstrate they are highly qualified before running? What's wrong with this? A ninth gross failure by the Harris-Walz campaign was, apart from not accelerating Special Counsel Jack Smith's criminal insurrection case against Trump, not demanding the Supreme Court to declare that Trump was prohibited from running for president in accordance with the Constitution's 14th Amendment, Section 3, which bars insurrectionists from running for political office. The insurrection and Trump's involvement was seen in real time on TV by most Americans. All of it was captured on video, incontestable evidence available to everyone at any time. There is no need for further fact-finding. The Supreme Court could not in good faith require further fact-finding. It would have had to decide without delay in accordance with the incontrovertible evidence. Not to enforce the Constitution's provisions is a serious dereliction of duty by any politician. Harris and Biden should have publicly asked the Republican Party to reject Trump as their candidate due to his indisputable involvement with the insurrection. If Republicans balked at removing Trump as their candidate, they would have undermined their legitimacy, and Harris should have pounced on their egregious disregard for the Constitution. In any case, it is incomprehensible that neither Biden nor Harris made a strong effort to prevent Trump from running in accordance with Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Arguably, they clearly failed in their sacred duty to enforce the Constitution. They failed the nation with their legal and political incompetence. Harris should have also explained why the Supreme Court's involvement was completely unnecessary, since there was no confusion or dispute about the meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. There's absolutely no ambiguity. The Supreme Court cannot contradict an unambiguous provision of the Constitution, just as it cannot contradict unambiguous evidence. A 10th gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not repudiating Senator Elizabeth Warren's absurd proposal to tax unrealized capital gains, a petty, envious class warfare measure which would destroy the economy by severely reducing private sector investments. At the same time, Harris should have rejected Biden's misguided scolding of wealthy individuals and companies to pay their fair share of taxes, for two reasons. First, whenever their effective tax rate is very low, it is mainly because of legal, rational deductions voted by Congress years ago, such as interest paid and depreciation. A justifiable tax reform would be to eliminate tax shelters, which misallocate capital away from productive investments, thereby reducing economic growth. One way to eliminate the appeal of tax shelters to offset capital gains taxes is by replacing capital gains taxes with a maximum 10% federal transfer tax on every sale of property, whether real estate, stocks, commodities, or collectibles, payable by the purchasers, not the sellers, as with all sales taxes. Second, wealthy individuals and companies contribute far more to society than the income taxes they pay. This is very important. In fact, they are responsible for the bulk of the nation's investments, including venture capital, which are absolutely necessary for economic growth and technological advances. They are the major contributors to the nation's total employment, while their employees generate income and sales taxes. And they themselves pay large amounts of sales taxes. After such explanations, Harris should have publicly addressed the left wing of the Democratic Party, saying, "Where would we be without many wealthy citizens and corporations? We'd be a third world nation." She should have rejected all calls for higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy, asserting that would be economically counterproductive. That would have been another election clincher. Wasn't the priority of defeating Trump more important than catering to counterproductive left-wing petty envy and prejudices against entrepreneurs, corporations, and the wealthy in general? Harris missed a crucially important opportunity to show that she understands how the economy works, that she is for pro-growth policies while not reducing efforts to solve social problems, that she celebrates successful corporate managements and entrepreneurs, that she disagrees with Biden's blanket assertion that unions built America, since it ignores the critical role of management and entrepreneurs, that she understands how QE can be used in lieu of tax increases to finance budget deficits whenever there is unemployment and unused capacity utilization, and that she understands solving the problem of poverty and low incomes sustainably requires not soaking the rich. Rather, it requires having truly excellent public schools run as the best private schools with strict discipline, lots of homework and study hall, school uniforms, highly qualified teachers, appropriately paid, and an enlightened curriculum. That's the way to reduce poverty and low incomes. The only way. Addressing the problem of mediocre public education has never been a concern of the Republican Party, but it should be the priority of the Democratic Party. Curiously, the Democratic Party has not made greatly improving public education a priority. It has failed the nation on education, just like the Republican Party. Somehow, no one complains, not even amongst Democrats. An 11th gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not having the vision to propose a major upgrade of our very deficient public schools nationwide, with the emphasis on developing and implementing an enlightened national core curriculum necessary for greatly increasing students' culture and knowledge required for success in the complex, highly competitive global economy. For uniform educational excellence across the nation, guaranteeing true equal opportunity, a prestigious, demanding national high school graduation exam would be instituted, offering a highly respected high school diploma for which all public schools would have to properly prepare their students. That is the only way to sustainably reduce poverty, low incomes, addiction, violence of all sorts, and illegal discriminations such as religious, racial, gender, and sexuality discriminations. That is also required to strengthen and preserve our democracy, since having many undereducated citizens and politicians constitutes a clear threat to democracy and human rights. Instead of proposing critically important universal preschool at all our public schools with federal funding subsidies, in addition to a major upgrade of our public schools nationwide, the Harris campaign proposed a one-off vote-buying college tuition debt cancellation, which many find unfair to those who have repaid their loans, and worse, would have no effect on improving our public schools, which should be the priority. What would be an enlightened high school curriculum? This is very important. An enlightened high school curriculum would be one which includes 4-year courses on 1. Psychology, complemented by group therapy and group parenting workshops. 2. Economics and stock market investing, complemented by investing and economic forecasting workshops and competitions, local and national. 3. The United Nations Charter and its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, along with the world history of human rights violations. That would avoid all woke controversies, including absurd, primitive calls for biblical generational guilt. 4. 20th century world history in great detail, including a focus on the rise of communism and fascism. 5. history of art, architecture, and design. 6. History of music. 7. Logic and critical thinking with case histories. 8. Empathy and ethics, again with case histories. 9. Comparative religion and the history of the monotheistic religions. 10. Foreign languages, facilitated by a course in Latin to sharpen our collective grammar proficiency, which has been in outrageous decline for decades. For example, many cable news anchors can't properly use I, me, he, him, she, her, they, them, we, us, who, which, did, done, hung, hanged. 11. Introductory and constitutional law. 12. The major mistakes in social, economic, and foreign policy over the past 100 years in the United States and abroad. Such a high school curriculum would have given me a head start worth decades. I wish I had had it. That's why I want everybody to have it going on from now. All our youth deserve and need an enlightened high school curriculum with these courses, in addition to the standard ones in math, English, science, chemistry, and physics, etc. What would be the result of every American having such a high school education? Would the result not be transformative, leading to economic and social prosperity, to much lower taxes, to much more successful foreign policies, to the end of political acrimony and strife, to a highly educated, productive, happy, optimistic, honest, serene, psychologically well-adjusted, well-behaved, courteous, and empathetic citizenry? What are we waiting for to have such a public school reform? Why have no political candidates or politicians ever proposed such reform? Why is there no support for political candidates proposing such reform, if you can find any candidates proposing such reform? Most probably, scandalously, hardly any of our presidents, senators, representatives, governors, and mayors would pass the high school graduation exam covering the 4-year courses of the enlightened curriculum listed above. Even fewer would pass a college-level exam covering those courses. The same goes for many talk show hosts, cable news anchors, and journalists. If we're serious about having highly qualified politicians, we should require each political candidate to take a written college-level exam covering those 4-year courses, in addition to an in-depth video-recorded oral exam conducted by a panel of experts. Both the written exam and the video-recorded oral exam would be posted online for eternity at a dedicated website available for everyone to review in order to get an idea of each candidate's being highly qualified or not. It would also make a lot of sense to have very demanding, prestigious 3-year postgraduate programs at leading universities, specially devised for political candidates, to ensure that they become experts in their own right in economic, social, and foreign policies. A 12th gross failure by the Harris-Walz campaign was not proposing that for the nation's success in the highly complex and competitive world, all American youths must get a college education, even those who think they will be manual laborers for their entire life. High school education was not mandatory when the nation was mainly agricultural. But once the nation started becoming highly industrialized over 100 years ago, political leaders saw the wisdom of making a high school education mandatory. To keep up with the present and the future of artificial intelligence, a college education must become mandatory. Otherwise, our economy will suffer enormously and poverty will surge. An excellent high school and college education for all is not only an economic imperative, it is also a social and political imperative in order to have psychologically well-adjusted, culturally knowledgeable, self-confident, productive citizens, immune to disinformation, and determined to defend democracy and human rights. No democracy can thrive and be rock solid without its citizens having a high average level of education. It was absurd for Harris and Biden to suggest just having a high school education is okay. It's certainly not okay in the highly complex, advanced, highly competitive global economy. It's not okay to just have a high school education. A 13th gross failure by the Harris-Walz campaign was not publicly pointing out that Trump's mistaken 2020 predictions that if Biden became president, the economy and the stock market would collapse because of his economic policies. They should have emphasized that contrary to Trump's predictions, the economy grew strongly, with unemployment very low, and the stock market at all-time highs. They should have suggested that Trump's mistaken predictions prove he is incompetent in economics, as further proved by his absurd high tariff proposals. Harris's failure to undermine Trump's credibility on economics and the stock market is baffling, given the unambiguous, incontrovertible public evidence proving Trump's incompetence. A 14th gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not pointing out Trump's enormous foreign policy failure regarding Afghanistan. Trump gave away Afghanistan's democracy and its women's human rights to the Taliban, signing an agreement to withdraw American troops in short order, tying Biden's hands and obliging him to abide by the agreement. Trump's outrageous deal with the Taliban was totally unjustified, since American troops were no longer engaged in combat and not suffering any losses, as they were only giving the Afghan army air power and intelligence support. Had that support continued for another 10 years, Afghanistan would have developed into a solid democracy, fully respectful of women's human rights, and the Taliban would have been defeated once and for all. Trump ignominiously and stupidly saved defeat from the jaws of victory in Afghanistan. And he likes to blame Biden for that. Biden had to withdraw from Afghanistan because if he hadn't, nobody would trust American presidents anymore, that their word would not be honored. You can't have treaties with other countries and then the next president invalidates them. Nobody will sign any treaty with you anymore. A 15th gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not severely condemning Trump's cozying up to Putin, even having meetings with him with no American translator present, in order not to have an official American governmental record of their conversations. That's quite suspicious and improper. And his refusal to criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Kamala should have pointed out that the Russian invasion was an outrageous violation of international law, including of the United Nations Charter and of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, whereby in exchange for Russia's guarantee of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, Ukraine transferred all its nuclear weapons to Russia. She should have also pointed out that the United States and the United Kingdom also signed the Budapest Memorandum and are therefore morally and legally obligated to defend Ukraine against Russia, since Ukraine upheld its part of the bargain. Kamala should have asserted that Trump's disregard for American international obligations and his refusal to commit to Ukraine's defense, along with his strange admiration for Putin and dictators in general, emboldened Putin to invade Ukraine. And that Trump has seriously undermined our credibility worldwide, making the world much more dangerous, including by repeatedly saying NATO is obsolete, which it is not, and by repeatedly saying he would have the United States leave NATO, which is incredibly irresponsible. Kamala should have also insisted that Trump is a veritable disgrace, an insult to our Constitution, to our history, and to all the American soldiers who have died in defense of freedom and democracy. Kamala should have repeatedly pointed out that no American presidents before Trump have ever admired and befriended dictators, and that Trump is un-American and untrustworthy, having betrayed our most important values. She should also have asserted that the profile of all dictators and aspiring dictators includes 1. a severe inferiority complex, along with severe insecurity due to deficiency of proper parental love, especially during childhood and adolescence. 2, cruelty. 3, abusiveness. 4, pervasive dishonesty, cheating, lying, deceiving. 5, a fixation with gaining wealth and power by any means. 6, general immorality. 7, egocentrism and lack of empathy. 8, a very narrow education. And 9, a lack of culture. A 16th gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not to have Kamala publicly challenge Putin to a live televised Zoom debate on his invasion of Ukraine and his massive obscene bombing of Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. She should have asked him to justify his invasion, a violation of both international law, see the United Nations Charter, and the Budapest Memorandum. She should have brought up his outrageous, repeated nuclear blackmail. She should have asked him why he abandoned communism, which he enforced for decades as a KGB agent. Also, she should have asked him if he was capable of defining fascism and Nazism, both of which he reviled his whole time as a communist. Putin would no doubt refuse to participate in such a debate, but that would undermine his legitimacy. Furthermore, Harris should have appeared at the scheduled time of the live debate and criticized Putin for refusing to debate while making the various points she had in mind. In challenging Putin to the debate, Harris would have shown strong leadership, which would have greatly enhanced her image worldwide and her candidacy for president. A 17th gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not defending Biden's policy regarding Israel, notwithstanding Israel's unconscionably destructive invasion of Gaza. It was not realistically possible to do more than severely criticize Israel's excessive reaction to Hamas's October 7th massacre of Israeli civilians. After all, Israel's very existence has been repeatedly threatened by Islamic forces from the day it became a sovereign nation in 1948, purely out of religious discrimination and hatred. The United States could not possibly break its long commitment to defend Israel against its religious enemies. But Kamala should have broken new ground by suggesting that the key to ending the interminable Israeli-Palestinian conflict is to resolutely confront monotheistic religious discrimination and hatred incited by the Bible and the Quran, not sweep it under the rug while believing that land for peace deals can ever succeed on their own. Kamala should have explained that the only way to achieve lasting peace is to emphasize and defend the principles of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all UN member nations have undersigned. She should have set aside religious taboos and said that whenever religions violate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they must be confronted and made to conform to modern morality. That is, to leave behind discriminatory, tribalistic, holy book incitements of hatred and violence. She should have pointed out that the God of monotheism irrationally contradicts himself, stating in the Old Testament that his only favored people are the Jews, the Israelites, and in the Quran that his only favored people are Muslims. That irrational contradiction is the obvious source of the religious conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Both sides must be encouraged to leave irrationality behind and embrace logic. Both sides must be encouraged to hold televised debates to discuss the history and the religious origin of their conflict, which dates back to the biblical times of Samson and Delilah and David and Goliath. Kamala should have pointed out that the conflict is undeniably based on religious discrimination and hatred, posing the question, would there be a conflict if the Israelis and Palestinians were of the same religion, or if they were all atheists? An 18th gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not explaining why she disagreed with Biden's slow arming of Ukraine with advanced weapons, preventing it from defeating the Russians as early as the summer of 2023, when Ukraine had lots of momentum, pushing back the Russians from much occupied territory. Finally, a 19th gross failure of the Harris-Walz campaign was not repeatedly bringing up the matter of Trump's January 6th violent, seditious insurrection, demonstrating a criminal mind and a grave disrespect for fair play, for democracy, and the rule of law. Kamala should have driven home to the voters that Trump and the Republican Party, given its support of Trump, notwithstanding the January 6th insurrection, is clearly a grave risk for our democracy, and that it is naive to believe his mentality has changed. In fact, there are no indications that he has changed for the better. She should have pointed out his repeated mafia-like threats of retribution against his political opponents who did nothing illegal. She should have brought up Germany's experience with Adolf Hitler and his Nazis. Hitler was jailed for an attempted coup, then released a year or two later. He got wiser and figured out how to get into power legally. Once in power, he became the dictator he always wanted to be. Trump could be following the same Hitler playbook. Trump has already stated at a rally that he'd like a third term, to the roaring applause of his followers. He even told them that there'd be no need for more elections after his second term, again to enthusiastic applause. Such statements are highly improper, going against our Constitution. Only an aspiring dictator would make such statements. Coming from a perennially calculating Trump, those statements can reasonably be seen as trial balloons, not just reflections of his inner desires. Whenever Trump sees his base enthusiastically approve of his controversial proposals, he generally believes it's a green light, a sign he can successfully go forward with them, no matter how contrary they are to existing norms. Harris should have repeatedly asked all voters to seriously consider whether taking a second risk with Trump made sense through numerous televised town hall discussions. In addition, Harris should have repeatedly brought up Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which bars oath-breaking insurrectionists from running for high office, explaining that it applies to Trump due to his inciting and directing the January 6th insurrection. Harris should have publicly encouraged President Biden to seriously consider blocking Trump from reassuming the president on 14th Amendment Section 3 grounds, while reminding him that he, Biden, as the current president, has absolute immunity for his official actions taken to defend our Constitution and our democracy from domestic and foreign threats. If Trump is not blocked from the presidency, and if he ends up following Hitler's playbook, which unfortunately cannot be excluded, we as a nation would go down in history as the greatest fools the world has ever seen, undeserving of all the sacrifices made by heroic Americans in the past, dedicated to democracy at home and abroad. With the 2024 voters and the Biden administration both having had the benefit of history as a guide and idiotically not heeding it. Very worrisome is that Trump is surrounding himself with many of the same people he had leading up to January 6th, and that he says he will pardon the January 6th criminal insurrectionists, many of them white supremacists and neo-Nazis, calling them patriots and hostages. That is an insult to the rule of law and civilized society, an attitude reminiscent of Hitler and fascist Nazi Germany, and a sign that he is not committed to democracy and the rule of law. He is an unrepentant, guilty insurrectionist who is constitutionally disqualified from running for high office and who repeatedly vows retribution against those who legally prosecuted him. It seems Trump, along with too many Americans, it seems that they don't realize that pardons, to be valid, must be free of conflict of interest and must be accompanied by a published written justification, moral or legal. Trump has no intention of respecting those requirements in accordance with the spirit and principles of the Constitution, which is a very moral document. There's no way the Constitution would have approved of pardons made to family members or friends or business associates, wherever there's a conflict of interest. Absolutely no way the Constitution, being a moral document, would ever have permitted such pardons to be valid. As if all that is not troubling enough and disqualifying, some of Trump's nominations for high positions are arguably shockingly unqualified and constitute serious national security risk. Biden should immediately, weeks before January 20th, 2025, remind the public of Trump's serious character flaws and his many egregious violations of the law until it all sinks in, with the majority of Americans fully realizing that Trump is not just a rogue, but a real existential threat to our democracy and to the free world. He should remind the voters that Trump should have already been barred from running again due to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, prohibiting oath-breaking insurrectionists from running for office. In view of all that, it behooves Biden to prepare Americans for the eventuality of requiring extraordinary measures to defend our Constitution and democracy, such as invoking Section 3 of the 14th Amendment against Trump before he is sworn in for the second time this coming January 20th, 2024. It is Biden's sacred duty and obligation to defend and enforce the Constitution. If he fails to act, he will violate his oath and betray the Constitution, the rule of law, and our democracy. Biden should explain that the Constitution realizes the possibility of occasional threats to itself and democracy coming from Americans themselves. It therefore intentionally sets guardrails against irresponsible American voters, legislators, and presidents who would threaten it through ignorant, foolish, or anti-democratic acts or decisions. If Biden is hesitant to act on his own convictions, he should quickly obtain a highly informed and publicized legal consensus before January 20th, in the hope it would significantly boost his confidence. Without delay, Biden should have the faculties of our leading law schools make their opinion public on the matter of the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which is self-executing, like Article 2, Section 1, 5, and how it applies to Trump. Abe Lincoln had the courage and conviction to defend the Constitution and our nation. Will Biden? Will the Democratic and Republican senators and representatives defend our Constitution? How many will rise to the occasion? How many will instead mimic the German politician's fecklessness facing Hitler's rise? Half of Americans, that is, Trump voters and the entire Republican Party, which embraces Trump's illegal candidacy, totally disregard 20th century history and our Constitution. And that is an indictment of our public schools and of much of our media. The result? Trump, the insurrectionist, has more weight than our Constitution, the rule of law, and our democracy. Biden should make clear to all Americans that if we end up with a dictator and a police state, there will be no way out for decades. Forget about congressional and judicial protections. They are crushed and rendered impotent in fascist police states. Political opposition is not tolerated. Dissenters are judicially persecuted, jailed, assassinated, executed, or simply made to disappear. That's the existential risk we face with Trump. The Constitution says it's a risk not to be taken. What will Biden do? Anything? Has he something in mind to defend our democracy at the last moment, or has he checked out? Not defending and enforcing the Constitution's critically important provisions, such as barring oath-breaking insurrectionists from high office, effectively means our Constitution has been tragically, idiotically, and disgracefully discarded. To repeat, not defending and enforcing the Constitution's crucially important provisions, such as barring oath-breaking insurrectionists from high office, effectively means our Constitution has been tragically, idiotically, and disgracefully discarded. What are the chances that Trump will respect our democracy since he disregards and violates our Constitution's 14th Amendment, Section 3. Heaven help us. Our democracy may well need the intervention of a deus ex machina in extremis. We should have never gotten to this point. It's a shameful national disgrace, as is the countrywide passivity and nonchalance. Thank you for listening to this long article, which you can view at my LinkedIn page, at my medium.com page, and on YouTube, on my YouTube site. Again, my name is Edward Sonino. Thanks again for listening, and I hope if you have time that you will try to read my article. It's quite complicated and long, and I think reading it would make things clearer than just listening to it being read. Thanks again for your attention.